Faith fascinates me. Faith disturbs me. I myself do not possess faith. I do not consider myself a man of faith. I'm not complaining or bragging, just facing facts and telling the truth. I see many people proclaim their faith, and I wonder what they feel that I do not. I'm happy that they're happy. But does God really generate their faith? How about self-inducement, crowd psychology? Why would the creator of the universe, if there be such a being, distribute faith to a helter-skelter collection of conflicting religions? Am I missing something? Is religious faith rational or rationalization? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. The word faith has multiple meanings. The faith that fascinates me is the wholehearted commitment to belief in a personal God devoid of external evidence or scientific proof. By this description, can religious faith be rational? Or should all religious faith be labeled irrational, meaning groundless, illogical, unreasonable? I begin in Oxford, England, with a philosopher of religion known for magnifying the significance of faith, John Cottingham. John, when I say or tell some friends that I would like to believe in God but can't quite see my way to do it, I'm told that I need faith. And faith always scares me because it seems that I would be putting myself in a psychological condition to rationalize what I want to believe, but really should not. So how can I understand religious faith?
It's problematic if you think the only model for reasonable belief is a scientifically based one, impartial assessment from evidence. Faith is something much more committed, much more, if you like, biased. So if it's that kind of commitment, perhaps it's just a response to my own needs. So how do we know it's not just a rationalization? Well, it is, I think, partly a matter of evidence. It's the evidence that arises from certain internal changes that you find yourself undergoing as a result of belief. It's not just a purely intellectual or cognitive state. It's bound up with all sorts of emotional states too, like hope, like trust.
I think it's clear that those kinds of internal emotions are positive for human beings. But every religion, as contradictory as they are when one looks at their teachings, claims to have each of those qualities benefit the individual. So if the process of religious commitment or belief can generate those feelings, and the religious beliefs themselves are so contradictory, doesn't that indicate that those feelings have nothing to do with some ultimate antecedent?
Well, the contradictoriness is certainly to the fore if we focus on the creedal elements. But if we focus more on the spirituality and the practices of the religion, we don't find contradiction. We find a remarkable convergence. In Judaism, in Islam, in Christianity, and certainly in certain forms of Buddhism too, you have an emphasis on submission, on humility, on giving up the grasping desires of the ego, and instead getting into a more receptive, more attuned frame of mind where emotions like gratitude and love come to the fore. These are, if you like, the moral core of the world's great religions. And the core of those various religions shows a remarkable convergence or overlap, I think.
Given that truth, one could come, I think, to one of two conclusions and no other. One conclusion is that there is some ultimate transcendent reality, But that ultimate reality would have to be so general as to destroy all the specific metaphysical claims of all of the religions other than some transcendent fact. The other alternative is that all religions basically tune into some basic human need generated by some evolutionary process that makes us feel better when we have these kinds of emotions like hope and trust, but there's no antecedent reality beyond that. So those are the only two possibilities, both of which are contradictory to the claims of religion.
Well, if there is such a need, and I think biologically there may be some evidence for that, it's a need for something. It's not just a wish for stability or equilibrium. If it was, we could dope ourselves up. But most human beings would reject that, I think, because they want something that satisfies the need, not just in a more permanent or stable way, but in a richer, more meaningful way. If you look at the great Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam, they all insist on the primacy of morality, that the ultimacy of the demand for righteousness and the need for humility before something ultimately and supremely good. So there's a remarkable convergence, but it's to be looked at in the moral domain and the practical domain. We shouldn't try and make the vehicles of the specific creeds harmonize in all respects.
If faith means to believe without any evidence, then faith does seem irrational. If faith means to believe without external evidence, then can faith be rational? John says that a different kind of evidence undergirds faith. Evidence that arises from internal changes caused by belief. Evidence catalyzed by commitment, even by a bias to believe. So faith can be rational? I'd like to be convinced, but I fall short. Each religion, each faith system, has specific central beliefs. And because faith usually means purchasing the whole package, when such central beliefs conflict, faith seems undermined. I could almost make sense of a God who allowed struggle, even evil. But I'd have trouble with a God who bestows faith to believers in religions with conflicting claims. So is faith rational or not rational? Is faith opposed to reason or somehow consistent with a different kind of reason? I go to Birmingham to meet New Zealand philosopher John Bishop, who follows William James in seeking to justify faith. John, how important is faith and how dominating must faith be if you're really going to apprehend a reality beyond the physical?
Right. Well, I mean, of course, your question does require us to consider exactly what we mean by faith. And of course, sometimes people build into the idea of faith a commitment that is somehow essentially irrational, or at least one might say irrational. So I'm not too happy with that. And I think it's because I've been very influenced by William James's famous lecture, The Will to Believe, in which he purports to give us a justification of faith. Now, there, in that lecture, I find that what he means by faith is not at all something that is opposed to reason or independent of reason. It's something that rather, one might say, goes beyond reason. So I have talked about a supra-rational rather than a contra-rational faith. And James, of course, was a scientist, and he thought it was extremely important that a legitimate faith be something that incorporated a scientific view of the world. So, for example, a Jamesian fideist would be quite opposed to the kind of faith we find, say, amongst creationists, where they think that what they're required to do by their faith is believe something that is contrary to our best scientific theories. James would say that that is never legitimate. The legitimate kind of religious faith would be a faith that accepted our best scientific understanding of the world, but moved beyond it.
But how does that comport with some in the religious tradition that absolutely require faith that's so strong even in the absence of coherence with any other belief that you have, where faith becomes super powerful, that it must abrogate other things?
It doesn't comport at all.
Some people think that's a positive, because if you have so much faith in contradiction to other things, that shows your utmost trust in God, so to speak. Right?
I don't doubt the sincerity of people who would think that, but I would be inclined to think that there is a kind of arrogance in that. It involves saying, I'm entitled to interpret my tradition as separating me from what the rest of the world is doing. And I think the kind of faith that I have would be a faith that takes seriously all the effort that humans have ever made to try and understand their circumstances and attempt somehow to integrate and make sense of it.
Wouldn't that bring you to the lowest common denominator, just some very general, maybe a kind of pseudo-spirituality? If you're looking for integrating all the human traditions and all the faith traditions, you'll wind up with something very thin.
What I mean is that each religious tradition, if it's going to be authentic, needs to incorporate our consensus about what the world is like. And it seems to me that in science, for example, we do get an emerging consensus. Yes. But of course, the further questions that are, so to speak, beyond science, like the value questions and the questions about our destiny, there we do have a plurality of different views, and of course views which are at various points mutually incompatible with one another. And the last thing that I would want to propose is that in that field, we settle on a lowest common denominator. So no, it wouldn't be lowest common denominator. It would rather be something that, in a sense, rather mimics the ideal of science, where, of course, scientific theories are supposed to vie with one another.
But if these religious traditions vie with one another, what's the purpose of faith in any of them?
Well, the purpose of faith is to be prepared to resolve vitally important issues that present themselves to you. You have to be open to recognizing how the faith of others is a challenge to you, but also an opportunity for you to think critically about the nature of your own faith position. So I think James thought that just as science has to develop in its own field, so the field of religious understanding needs to be treated in a kind of scientific way. Now, I know that turns upside down what we started off with.
And most religious people would completely reject that, because they would say that abrogates faith and that takes God out of the picture and totally changes the orientation from God's power to our power, and
That's
would
right.
reject everything you said.
Yes, that's because they are confusing wholehearted commitment to a view of the world with dogmatic adherence to it, and those two are not the same thing.
John claims his faith to be super-rational, not contra-rational. He says faith should settle only those questions that cannot be settled by evidence. Moreover, belief systems that elevate faith above evidence are arrogant, he says, because they claim private access to universal truths. But, sorry, John, isn't that precisely what most religions do? Isn't that what most religions are? Perhaps we should tease apart varieties of rationality, comparing three adjectives that modify faith: rational, irrational, and non-rational. I go to London to meet philosopher Julian Baggini. Though an atheist, Julian focuses on faith and on how faith energizes religious people.
There's a tendency sometimes for people to claim that all beliefs are a matter of faith, ultimately, because no belief has 100% proof. Well, I think that's a really misunderstanding of what religious faith is. Faith, in a religious sense, seems to be a special kind of belief. It's not just the belief that this chair isn't going to disappear, or that, you're not going to try and kill me after this or something. It's a special kind of thing which requires some kind of leap. And I think, there's the great stories of faith you have in the Bible, for instance, are all about that. It's about a man who is willing to sacrifice his own son, contrary to all the moral principles and all human decency, because he trusts that a messenger from a God he believes in is a genuine messenger and that the request is real. Now, faith is celebrated in religion as belief kind of in the extraordinary, which goes way beyond what the evidence gives you. It's a leap, it's a trusting. Now, I can see why faith is celebrated as this leap, and that's what makes it special. But then I think that's the problem with it. I think, unfortunately, we can't justify that leap. Why should we make that leap?
One psychosocial issue is when you do make that leap, your allegiance to the group becomes stronger because you have then overridden your own rationality so that your faith in God attenuates your own powers of reasoning, which then in the religious group that you're in makes you more solid within that environment.
I think there could well be something in that idea, that somehow by giving up your own claims to reason, you're accepting the fact that your own powers of reason are not strong enough. You're going to believe in something on the basis of something else. Now, a lot of people would say that means you're being irrational. Well, there is a difference between being irrational and what you might call being non-rational. We often believe things for non-rational reasons. We believe things not because we have an argument, but because we kind of have to, or we feel they're right. Irrational is going contrary to reason. I think perhaps faith at its best is simply believing in a way which isn't based on reason at all. Neither contrary to nor supported by.
I actually like that because the kind of faith I like are people who recognize that they believe in God but don't try to use bad arguments to support their belief.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is a real problem. I think that people kind of sometimes want it both ways, because what happens is people will say, you rationalist atheists, you think it's all a matter of reason and rationality. It's not about that. It's about faith. But then the conversation moves on, and suddenly they're using rational arguments to say, how do you explain the Big Bang and so forth?
Yeah, although if I have a faith, then I would want to look, though, at the physical world and see, are there contradictions? So I think it's a fair progress to have the faith, but then look to the physical world to see if it's consistent with your belief, and if it's not consistent, then that may shake your belief.
I totally agree with that. I mean, you should check for consistency against the world. But, that's a very different thing. It's one thing to say, look, I have my religious faith and I am a scientist, and the basis of these beliefs are different, but there's no inconsistency between them. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to say, I have my religious faith and I'm a scientist, and actually, I think my science supports my religious belief. Well, you could do that, but then if you're doing that, then, are you really saying your belief is based on faith or on science? The problem of evil is a very good example of this. People who have a belief in God, a faith in God, and then they look at the fact that, there is a lot of suffering in the world. It seems to be unnecessary, it seems to be pointless, it seems to be something that a loving God could stop. How do they deal with that? Well, I think I'm kind of disturbed by people who actually try too hard to kind of come up with a rational argument as to why their God would tolerate that. I kind of prefer people to be honest and say, do you know what, this is troubling, this is difficult, and you can't really rationally account for it, but I have my faith in God. There's no inconsistency in the sense that in ways we can't possibly comprehend, it may just be that somehow this is all for the best, this is necessary, but I can't begin to understand how this is necessary, how this is all for the best, and I have to accept that this is an inadequacy of my rational understanding of the world.
To me, no faith worth having is ever justified by weak, specious arguments. That's why I distinguish non-rational faith from irrational faith. Irrational faith is groundless, illogical, unreasonable, and therefore irrational faith is always wrong. Non-rational faith relies on inner feelings, not outer facts, and can be a legitimate basis for engendering belief. While non-rational faith leaps beyond external evidence, it is not groundless, but still must reject weak, specious arguments. I should now distinguish between faith as a kind of rationality and faith as rationalization, a psychological mechanism without any godlike antecedent. I ask an evolutionary biologist who is a believer, Jeffrey Schloss. Jeff, is faith rational or is it rationalization?
I would say it's probably a little of either in different people and in all of us at different times, but mostly neither. If by rational you mean that it's a deduction from arguments, I think there are arguments for the existence of God that, unlike my atheist friends, I think they're plausible. But like them, I don't think they're compelling. But I don't know anybody who believes in the existence of God because of those arguments. But even if somebody did believe just in the proposition that God exists, that's not what religious faith is anyways. Religious faith is entrusting ourselves to his care and love. So I don't think people get there by arguments, although arguments may get you as far as agnosticism. And in terms of rationalization, by that I take it that you mean kind of thinking up post hoc reasons to justify something that don't really wash. Mm-hmm. There's a fair amount of that in religious traditions. But I don't think all post hoc reasoning is rationalization. Let's take the moral domain. There's a fair amount of empirical work right now that indicates that certain kinds of moral judgments precede reasons for them, that we have them innately or intuitively, and that people provide reasons afterwards. Now, sometimes when we do something and we think about it morally, we might rationalize. That is to say, at some place we might know it's wrong, and we might invent reasons to justify it. But that's a very different enterprise than trying to understand in a rational context the structure and implications of a belief that we may be naturally disposed to prior to reasons. Now, how we come to belief to begin with may include some arguments for at least getting as far as thinking a hypothesis is plausible, and I think arguments for God can do that. But then there may be intuitions toward the belief is true. There may be profound experiences. Pascal had such an experience, I have to confess, I did. The portal to belief for me was through an overwhelming experience.
Why did you trust that?
Well, I have to confess that I didn't have the capacity not to trust it. Whatever part of me it is that thinks I recognize reality, like having a conversation with you right now, was more profoundly engaged in this experience than anything I'd ever had. Now the question, though, becomes after the experience, what do you make of it? And there, the beliefs that an experience like that generate have to prove fruitful in understanding the world. So there's the case where I wouldn't say rationalization, but I would say post hoc reasoning became extremely important. And now the question arises, okay, is how do you distinguish between post hoc reasoning or maybe even post hoc theory or assumption testing versus rationalization? And by the way, we do the former in science all the time, right? This Popperian view of science that,
Right.
So really core beliefs, if something doesn't work out, we invent ancillary hypotheses, and at some point in both science and religious belief, it doesn't work. And then we abandon a belief, or we significantly modify it, or we live with ambiguity, or it does work. I don't think religious belief is fundamentally either a rationalization or rational in the sense of coming to it by proof. But I think it is rational in the larger sense of rationality. That is to say, starting with givens, with an assumption, with fundamental commitments, and then trying to understand life through the rational entailments of those and starting positions.
So is religious faith rational, or is it rationalization? That depends on whether inner feelings count as evidence. And while faith should never be irrational, it can well be non-rational, meaning that the category of external rationality does not apply. Collective faith strengthens group cohesion, which seems more consistent with a rationalization theory of faith. Personally, I'd find it odd for God to inspire similar faiths in contradictory religions. If faith is founded on lowest common beliefs, then doesn't faith lose its punch? I respect those who profess their faith, though I myself have no envy. I'd fear arrogating to myself the favor of God, if there is a God. I have at times desired to believe in God. Perhaps my yearning is a kind of faith. Some say that approaching God rationally is doomed to failure, and that the only way to truly know God is through faith. I get it, although I haven't gotten it. Maybe that's why I'm no closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.